Hi. We will now talk to Tariq Ali. You need no introduction, and I've said that of very few people. It is not a way of avoiding talking about your history, but simply because it is an established fact. You have taken with considerable courage and consistency highly critical positions of the British government and this civilization in general. And you've written a kind of very angry book, Rough Music. Can you first talk about the title?
Well, when the bombings happened in London in July, like every other Londoner, I was incredibly angry that they'd happened. But I wanted to understand the causes of these bombings. And at that time, British culture, the dominant political culture, didn't want to listen. And I tried to explain to them that even if you do not support the consequences, you have to understand the causes. Because unless you understand the causes, these things can happen again. But they did not want to accept that the war in Iraq had anything to do with this. And for 2 whole weeks, the dominant culture of this country, the media, the BBC, was in total denial. It has nothing to do with Iraq. And then gradually, as they began to conduct opinion polls, they found out that the views I expressed in The Guardian the following day, saying this is a big tragedy, it's unacceptable, the carnage we don't accept, but it has a reason. And the reason is this government's decision to go to war in Iraq and occupy another country. That this was also, it turned out, the view of 66% of the British people, which came out 2 or 3 weeks later. But the fact that it was covered up made me angry. And the fact that we then witnessed a public execution on the British underground when a young Brazilian electrician was killed for no rhyme or reason angered me even more. And I just felt that if this went on in this way, the civil liberties of British citizens who have not even people who are all that political, like the Brazilian electrician, are under threat. So I sat down and wrote this book, Rough Music, in a real rage and an anger. And thank God that Verso, this radical publishing house, exists, and they published it. That's all. Really, it was something which should have been said by the media, by lots of pundits, by television, saying this is why it's happened and let's try and stop it happening again. But because the political elite didn't want to accept that, they were completely out of step with the country as a whole, as they are today, when they go in and support what the Israelis and Americans green-lighted in Lebanon. They are completely out of touch. The bulk of the population of this country does not agree with it, but the political elite doesn't represent it.
You've written it in a kind of rage, as you say yourself, but nevertheless I'm kind of very surprised by how moderate your recommendations are, because it ends with 5 recommendations, and one of the recommendations, the first one is to withdraw from Iraq and Afghanistan. The second one is to stop financing religious schools. The third one is to undo the connection between England and Great Britain. The fourth one is to defend civil liberties. And the fifth one is a peasant revolt. Well, you surely must mean that metaphorically, but I was kind of wondering whether this agenda doesn't deserve an update, because the repertoire is kind of familiar. Very few people disagree with it, and I'm kind of wondering whether there is not in the current exactly this discrepancy that you describe, which is actually not about the government keeping anything secret, but the government having a separate life from the population?
Well, this is it. As you say, the 5 points I make at the end of Rough Music are relatively speaking moderate, and for me very moderate indeed. But the fact that they still cannot be accepted by the political elite, either Labour or Conservative in this country, that's what's deeply shocking. And you know, what you increasingly see now is a real anger with this government in Britain, that large numbers of people, even people who are not so political, absolutely loathe Tony Blair.
Yeah.
And the response of the Labour Party to this is, if you loathe Tony Blair, we understand, we'll give you Gordon Brown. But you know, we say what Gordon Brown has exactly the same politics as Tony Blair. It's not a personal thing against Blair. It's not the cut of his clothes or how he looks, it's what he does. So we don't want a politician who repeats what Blair does in a slightly different way. We want a different sort of politics, and that's what these 5 points are there for. But the fact that the political elite cannot accept them indicates, if you like, the disjuncture between what people want and what the political elite can give. And in Latin America, this disjuncture has led to a whole rise of popular and populist movements challenging traditional politics. And that's why I wrote that we need a peasants' revolt, that the British citizens should see themselves like Latin American peasants in Peru and Bolivia, and learn from them, because they are in a way more advanced than you are.
I wanted to ask you how you see the current moment in summer 2006.
The current moment, I think, is a big tragedy. That we have, as I.L. Weizmann was saying a few minutes ago, a country which can get away with murder. It can get away with destroying the social infrastructure of states. It can get away with reducing Gaza to the status of a camp, a large prison camp. It can do whatever it wants, and no one in the so-called international community is permitted to challenge it. And if you challenge it, you are attacked, saying, how dare you challenge it, because of the crimes committed against the Jewish people in Europe during the Second World War, which were, if you like, the crimes, within inverted commas, of European civilization. Why should the Palestinians or the Lebanese be the victims and be punished for those crimes? But Europe cannot speak up anymore. They go along with it. We have a situation where they say, bomb for another 2 weeks and then you might have to stop. We might have to stop you. And meanwhile, the entire social infrastructure of Lebanon has been destroyed. And you know, I would like to just say something else on this, which affects architecture. It really does. When you have architects beginning to organize against this horrific wall which is being built and is being built in Palestine, Israel, people get very nervous. You can't object. You can't speak up against it. And I have to say that I was deeply shocked when an architect of the stature of Richard Rogers, or let me give him his proper title, Sir Richard Rogers, was attacked when he went to New York to build the Jacob Javits Center, or his firm, and they said, we will not give you this contract because in your office a meeting took place of Palestinian, Israeli architects who are not in favor of the wall. Instead of saying, I believe in the freedom of architects as any other citizens to think what they like, he completely capitulated. Hired a public relations guy to describe in a statement a defense of that wall and saying that this wall is necessary to fight against terrorism. Now that is a level of intimidation which exists in this world today. And the fact that people like him, who are extremely wealthy and don't need too much more money, cave into this, I find deeply shocking.
I think we have so far kind of avoided ad hominem discussions today, and I think it's in this case maybe better since he's not here to
No, we
defend
should have
himself.
a debate with him. I'm in favor of a big public debate with him, saying, why did you do that? I like him. You know, he's someone I know. But we
he's
should
not
say
here.
to him, why did you do it?
We invited him, but he's not here.
Ah, okay. I'm sorry about that. Yeah.
But you brought up architecture, and I was actually wanted to ask you the same question I asked Chantal Mouffe before, which is, I was wondering how you think that actually art, architecture and literature can contribute in the shaping of a kind of a more mature, antagonistic political position. And I was particularly interested in asking you also why, besides the type of book like rough music Ram mentioned, you also write fiction.
Well, I started writing fiction in the 1990s, early 90s. And the set of novels which have, which are translated all over the world, is known as the Islam Quintet. And this is a set of novels I started writing after the first Gulf War, when I heard a commentator on the BBC, who should have known better, saying that the Arabs were a people without a culture. And just hearing that remark angered me so much that I wanted to reply to it, and I felt one couldn't reply to it just like that. One had to think and reflect and research. So I went to Spain and Portugal and spent months there researching the period of the medieval period when Jews, Muslims, Christians lived together and what happened. And then seeing the architecture which remains of that period, especially in Spain, in Granada, in Cordoba. In Cordoba you have this amazing mosque, the Grand Mosque, and in the heart of that mosque there is a church, as if the mosque has been raped by the church. And the Spanish king who came to see the church said to the architects, he said, "You have destroyed something which is unique and inserted your mosque in." But what he didn't understand was that if they hadn't put the church in the mosque would have been destroyed. And so that, seeing the architecture of medieval Spain and what had survived, I decided to write a novel about it, to try and reconstruct that civilization and its last days and what happened to it. And that's how I started writing fiction. And then the late Edward Said, the dear friend who read it, said, "You can't stop now, you have to tell the whole bloody story of the clashes between Islamic civilization and Western Christendom." And so the 4 novels have been done. The first is on Spain, the second is on the Crusades, the fictional memoirs of Saladin, the third is the Ottoman Empire and its decline, and the fourth is a very little known period of the Arab period in Sicily, as Sultan in Palermo, of how even after Arab civilization in Sicily was defeated, for 150 years, Arab culture remained. And the Normans who took over spoke Arabic, educated their kids in Arabic, because this was the language of learning. And this was my response to that ignorant commentator who said that Arabs were people without a political culture. So that's what caused me. And the 5th novel, which has to be set in the modern world, which is going to be a problem. Because all civilizations are in a state of deep crisis, in my opinion. Not just Islam, but also Christianity and Judaism.
I want to kind of make one more effort. I think that all your opinions are probably shared by kind of the vast majority in this room. But nevertheless, and all your anger is probably shared, but in terms of trying to take the temperature in terms of willingness to undertake political action or a political imagination, what kind of action you would take, there is perhaps not a despair, but a kind of real sense of inadequacy or powerlessness. And there I still find your proposal that we become peasants, and particularly South American peasants, a little bit wanting.
Well, obviously I don't believe that the people of England, Wales and Scotland can actually revert to peasant status physically or sociologically. But I think they might actually benefit if they did revert to it in terms of rebellion. Some of the most amazing rebellions we've seen against this neoliberal economic system, for instance, against water privatization in Bolivia, against electricity privatization in Cusco, against landlords in Brazil, against slum dwellers in Venezuela, against just the collapse of the whole system in Argentina. These are things which the British or the European trade union movement could learn a great deal from, but I think they are stuck. I think they cannot learn anymore, and so I think a new generation has to arise which comes up with a different style and a different form of politics and say, enough. Enough of you people, enough of the way in which you run the world and run this country and run Europe, and we're going to try something else. We can't will it into being in a voluntaristic fashion, but it's something I think which has to come, and that's why Latin America is what excites me.
And do you see any signs here?
I see very few signs here, actually. I think within the younger generation there is now a growing anger, but I don't see, if you look at the country where we've just had a change of government in Europe, Italy, the removal of Berlusconi and that whole thing has brought a new government into office which is doing very similar things. And so we have a situation where democracy itself is being hollowed out in the United States and in Europe, and where the differences between center-left and center-right hardly exist. And the big tragedy for me is that this is alienating whole generations from any political engagement. The last two general elections in Britain, the majority of people between the ages of 18 and 26 did not vote. And they are the future of this country and the rest of the world. So, I'm optimistic because I think if changes take place in one part of the world, slowly the news begins to seep through and spread. But what I do not believe is that religion or religious politics are the answer in any way. I think that's a disaster for whoever, whether it's Muslims, Jews, Christians. Going into politics exclusively through a religious prism doesn't take you anywhere. And that's why the situation in the Middle East is also quite depressing.
I have a very last question, which is if you have any kind of unrealized projects, dreams?
My unrealized project is the overthrow of this system.
Thank you.
Many thanks, Tariq Ali. Thank you very much.